Welcome to this introduction to human rights. Human rights are HRTS 2500 at Webster University in Geneva. My name is Dr. Curtis Doebbler. I will be teaching this course for 6 weeks. It is a 6-week course. It's a short course during the summer session, but it should give you an introduction to what human rights are. And that's pretty important, whether you want to work particularly in human rights or even if you want to work in trade or another area of law, particularly in Geneva, Switzerland, which is the human rights capital of the United Nations and considered the human rights capital of the world by many people. Human rights or knowledge of human rights is essential. We will focus on understanding what are the treaties that create human rights and create human rights instruments. Now, of course, or human rights institutions, I should say. Of course, human rights didn't come from treaties, but we'll see that today most human rights are put down in treaties, written down by states in agreements between them, and that forms the basis of what we are able to hold states to as obligations to protect their people. So we will look at the human rights treaties or instruments, and we will look at institutions that implement and interpret human rights. As I mentioned, this is a short course. It's only 6 weeks, and we'll meet twice a week for about 2 hours and 45 minutes each session. This first week, we will look primarily at an introduction to the course, and I will try to provide you these videos every week for a short time, only 5 minutes per video, to give you some of the main points that we cover in the course. This week, we will look at the history of human rights, how it came from other antecedents like minority rights, diplomatic protection, and international humanitarian law. In the second week of the course, we will go on to look at the United Nations instruments for the protection of human rights, because those are probably the most broadly developed today. They include the principal organ for the United Nations, or principal body dealing with human rights, which is the Human Rights Council, that is a subsidiary body of a principal organ of the United Nations, the General Assembly. The Human Rights Council is based here in Geneva and meets almost 40 weeks a year. Even when it is not meeting, there are people at work at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, part of the Secretariat, another principal body of the United Nations under the United Nations Charter. And that body not only acts as a secretariat to the Human Rights Council, but it also facilitates the work of treaty bodies as well as some of the special mechanisms, and there are many, almost 50, of the Human Rights Council. In the third week, I should say, we will move on to look at the regional protection of human rights. We'll see that the most developed regional systems are here in Europe, namely the European Court of Human Rights, but also now even the Court of Justice of the European Union can deal with human rights after the European Union adopted its fundamental charter of human rights. We'll also look at the Inter-American system, the African system. In both those systems, there is a commission and a court of human rights. In Africa, it's called the Court of Justice and Human Rights, based in Arusha in Tanzania. We'll also look quickly or briefly at some human rights mechanisms and instruments in other regions of the world. For example, in the Arab world, there's the Arab Charter on Human Rights, an Arab Commission on Human Rights, or a permanent Arab Commission on Human Rights. In the Asian group of countries, or ASEAN, the Asian nations and Southeast Asian nations, there's a human rights mention within the charter of that body and a human rights commission set up to look at human rights, although without the same powers as a court. And we'll see that even within the Organization of Islamic States, that is 57 states on 4 continents, there is a mechanism for dealing with human rights. So in the third week, we will look at those regional protections or even cross-regional protections of human rights, both the institutions and the instruments. In the fourth week, we will look at some of the obligations states have to protect human rights. The obligations that Oliver de Schutter, in the book that we will use during this course, International Human Rights Law, the second edition of this book, he writes that these are obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill those human rights. Sometimes it's called ensure, protect, and fulfill those human rights. Those are academic designations, but we'll try to understand what obligations states really have in relation to individuals, and we'll see groups' human rights. In the 5th week of the course, we'll look at some particular human rights, focusing on 2 large issues, but other issues that students in class might want to raise, but particularly the prohibition of discrimination, or the principle of non-discrimination, and the principle of self-determination. These are 2 of the major, if you will, human rights principles, although particularly non-discrimination is not merely a principle on its own, but one that is often embedded in other human rights. For example, the right to health, a social and economic right that is found in many international treaties and probably part of customary international law, requires that a state ensure that every individual under that state's jurisdiction has access to health care on a non-discriminatory basis. But we'll look at those rights in more detail in week 5. Non-discrimination and self-determination, and other rights that you might want to suggest. Finally, in week 6, we'll look at the limitations that might be imposed on human rights. That week will also include your final examination. So I look forward to seeing you all during this course, and good luck.